Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are immersing ourselves in a novel that feels less like a book and more like, well, a sustained act of literary endurance. We're talking about László Krasznahorkai's The Last Wolf.
Right, a text that's as bleak and, frankly, obsessive as its subject matter.
And if you know Krasznahorkai, you know this isn't exactly light reading.
Not at all. And this book, it takes his experimental style to a really radical place.
Yeah.
The big thing here, the constraint, is that the whole novel is basically one single, gigantic, multi-page sentence.
It's just an overwhelming commitment, isn't it? When I first picked it up, I did wonder, is this just a gimmick, a technical exercise?
It's a fair question. But I think we can unpack this straight away. Our sources are pretty clear. This marathon sentence is doing some serious psychological and thematic heavy lifting.
Okay, so it's not just style for style's sake.
Definitely not. It really embodies the narrator's whole state of mind. The sources describe it as flowing like slow-flowing lava, mirroring this overwhelming obsessive anxiety.
Yeah.
And this deep sense of futility that it can't be resolved. There's no punctuation break.
So you're immediately dropped into this stream of consciousness that can't stop, can't really breathe, and never quite lands on a final meaning.
Exactly. You're just swept up in it.
And we meet this incredibly anxious mind in a setting that just perfectly captures his sense of failure. This really dingy, darkly funny Berlin bar. It's called Sparschwein.
Which means saving piggy bank.
Right. The irony is just fantastic. This high-level philosophical angst being spilled out in this low, cynical place named after, well, failed saving.
It absolutely sets the tone for the whole experience. Our protagonist, he's this failed scholar, really downtrodden, used to be an academic, now just sort of scraping by.
And he's telling his story to the bartender.
To this deeply, deeply uninterested Hungarian bartender, yeah. And the whole setup is just a comedy of errors. He got this letter, probably by mistake, inviting him to Extremadura in Spain to write some kind of, travel piece.
A commission he clearly didn't deserve or wasn't qualified for.
Not really, no. But he takes it. He accepts this mistaken invitation, and almost immediately his own mission completely takes over from the official one.
So he goes to Extremadura, but not to write some nice little piece about the flowering wildlands, which, let's be honest, is probably what the funding foundation wanted, some PR.
Exactly. Instead, he gets obsessed, utterly fixated on finding the final kind of heartbreaking truth about the extinction of the Iberian wolf in southern Spain.
Okay, and that obsession, that shift in mission, that really forces the core question for us in this deep dive, doesn't it?
It does. We're basically looking at how this novel grabs hold of that global feeling of ecological finality, what our sources call the endgame grammar, and transforms that huge abstract despair into this very small, very personal story that's just defined by failure, systemic failure, language failure, ethical failure.
Right. And the goal for you, listening, is to understand how that structural refusal, that failure to conclude, actually forces this really profound ethical step back from our usual human-centered ways of looking at things.
Yeah, the novel seems to argue that real environmental understanding might come from silence, from acknowledging limits, not from creating more grand human stories about it.
Okay. So to get there, we'll be using narrative theory, some ecological criticism, ethical analysis.
It's a mix. But crucially, we're sticking really close to the novel itself, the details within it, while also placing it right in its specific context, that 2005 to 2009 period.
Because that era provides the whole charged background for the title The Last Wolf.
Absolutely. The meaning is embedded in that time.
Okay, let's dive right into that context then. Section 1. History's roots and the grammar of the endgame. So if the novel feels terminal, feels like an ending, it's partly because it was written in the shadow of some really intense environmental talk back then.
That's exactly right. The mid to late 2000s, they were a distinct peak, almost hysterical sometimes, with this last chance rhetoric. We're going to have to revisit that mood to get why the narrator feels this desperate urgency, and then why he's so disillusioned.
I remember that time climate change really shifted, didn't it? It went from being this specialist scientific thing to being right at the emotional public center of everything.
Absolutely. The big turning point was probably around 2006, 2007. You had the IPCC's fourth assessment report coming out, basically saying warming was unequivocal. That kind of ended the debate for many.
And Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth was everywhere.
Exactly. It dominated the media, popular culture. It translated the complex science into this, moral and political must-do. Reports on climate change, they hit this unprecedented media high points early in 2007. It just pushed the issue right to the front. globally.
So you have this clear science meeting this huge popular media wave. It must have created this feeling that something had to give, something big had to happen soon.
Which leads directly to the next critical point. The build-up to the 2009 Copenhagen Climate Summit, COP15.
Oh, Copenhagen. Yeah.
The political language around Copenhagen was just
Yeah.
intensely apocalyptic. You heard phrases like irreversible changes, tipping points, the last chance, constantly. Politicians, activists.
Everyone's using it.
Yeah. Our sources really emphasize this media political propaganda, hammering home this idea that this was truly, quote, the last chance to save the planet.
That framing. Wow. The ultimate showdown, the final shot. That must have created an almost unbearable level of public hope and anticipation. It frames failure not just as disappointment, but as like biblical catastrophe.
Precisely. And that brings us to the third point, the one most relevant, I think, for Krasznahorkai's narrator. The absolutely devastating disappointment of COP15.
It just fizzled.
It failed. It failed to deliver a binding, meaningful agreement. And the result was this huge public frustration, this profound sense of betrayal. The sources really highlight that massive, frustrating gap. On one hand, you had this aggressive, dramatic rhetoric used to get people engaged, this rational optimism that change was possible.
And on the other,
The reality of political deadlock, what the sources call realistic impotence, it just didn't happen.
that emotional whiplash, it's key. You're told the sky is falling, the solution is right here, and then you just watch the whole political machine kind of drop the ball. The result has to be exhaustion.
Total exhaustion.
Yeah.
And that exhaustion is the core psychological mood of the novel.
Yeah.
The failure of COP15. It caused this sharp, noticeable drop in public concern about the environment globally right after the summit collapsed.
So the novel absorbs that real-world cycle. High hopes, political failure, and then this deep, tired futility.
That's the endgame grammar right there.
Okay, now let's bring that big global feeling down to the specific place in the novel. Extremadura, Spain, and the local story of loss, the Iberian wolf.
Right. So the wolf population in southern Spain, it had already been hammered, by human activity eradication programs long before the novel's time frame. By the 2000s, the species was mostly way up north of the Duero River. Down in Extremadura, the wolf was basically a ghost, a memory.
And what's really interesting is that the finality of that loss, it's already kind of murky, isn't it? It's wrapped up in ambiguity, even in the historical record the narrator looks into.
It is. The novel mentions this scientific magazine article, the one that says the last wild wolf south of the Duero might have died around 1983.
Might have.
Exactly. But the novel's whole structure, it's built on the uncertainty of that specific date, that specific death. The last wolf becomes less a hard biological fact and more of a local legend, an event whose details just shift and contradict each other depending on who's telling the story.
That chain of rumors, that's central to the narrator's whole quest, right? He's forced to wade through all these conflicting local stories.
From Chen Clones, the cynical hunter, to Jose Miguel, the sort of heartbroken game warden.
The truth is just scattered, elusive, already buried under layers of local myth, maybe denial.
Absolutely. And the person trying to piece this fragmented story together is himself, fragmented. Krasznahorkai's own Eastern European background really feeds into the protagonist being this out-of-time kind of figure.
The failed scholar. He's the perfect person to be telling this story of breakdown.
Exactly. He's failed academically, he's precarious economically, just drifting around Berlin, deeply cynical. And this profile, it really reflects that post-history fatigue you saw in parts of Central and Eastern Europe after the Cold War.
Right. That initial excitement about the end of history just didn't last.
It evaporated pretty quickly. It was replaced by disillusionment, a sense of being marginalized, cynicism about this new global liberal order.
So the scholar is already this walking embodiment of emotional failure, steeped in the kind of resignation that comes after political systems let you down. It almost feels inevitable that he'd be drawn to an ecological failure in Spain. He's mapping his own collapse onto the planets.
The failure is baked into his character, his background, and the story he chooses to chase. Which brings us right to the structure, the rhythm the novel itself adopts.
How does all this gloom, global, personal, translate directly into the way the text feels, the structure we actually read?
Well, the novel structurally takes on this relentless cycle. Approach, failure, silence.
Yeah.
The narrator gets close to what seems like the final truth.
Yeah.
Then the information slips away, or maybe he actively refuses it. Then the narrative kind of settles into this momentary quiet, this stasis, only to immediately start the obsessive approach all over again.
Which perfectly mirrors that real-world thing we just talked about. The surge of hope, then the collapse, then the exhaustion.
Right. And this cycle, it creates what the sources call an elegy-like reading experience. It's slow, it's drawn out witnessing, not like a fast-paced plot.
Yeah?
You, the reader, you're subjected to these repeated bursts of hope that just get extinguished again and again.
Forcing this state of mournful resignation.
The endgame grammar translated directly into the pace and the actual flow of the story itself.
Okay, let's shift gears into section 2, because this is where the genius, I suppose, of the novel structure really hits you. The narrative experiment structure as failure. We have to go back to that single sentence. How does that monolithic structure work psychologically?
It basically makes the flow of anxiety physically present on the page. It just doesn't allow for any resolution formally or psychologically. That long sentence, George Sears described it as moving like slow-slurring lava.
Right.
It uses these continuous conjunctions because, so then, piling up information, clause after clause, relentlessly, sometimes for pages on end.
It gives neither the reader nor the narrator any breathing room, no place to rest mentally. He's just trapped in this endless cycle of thinking and justifying.
And crucially, he's constantly correcting himself within that stream. Our sources point to this key stylistic thing, negation correction syntax.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
It means he'll say something, then immediately realize it might be too strong or maybe too honest or just not quite right, and he instantly denies it or revises it, all within the same continuous thought, no period break.
Can you give us a feel for how that sounds? Negation correction is a bit technical.
Sure. Imagine his thought process sounding something like this.
Mm.
I went there because I wanted the article. No, hang on. Not because I wanted the article itself. That was just pointless institutional stuff. But because I needed to feel that sense of an ending, And so my accepting the trip wasn't really professional ambition. It was more like a morbid curiosity. Except, well, I also needed the money, didn't I? So the motive was sort of cynical and pure at the same time, which means, I guess, I can't really claim either one fully.
Wow. Yeah, the sentence just gets longer and more tangled, but the actual meaning gets kind of diluted, delayed. He keeps undermining himself.
That's the paradox, exactly. The sentence grows, but clarity recedes. It reinforces this linguistic failure.
And he knows it's failing.
Oh, completely. He's fully aware. He comments that language itself has thoroughly degenerated. He sees his own words as this corrupted, powerless cycle, like dirty clothing or something decaying. That single huge sentence becomes the ultimate act of compulsive and futile retelling. The more he talks, the less capable his language seems of capturing or clarifying anything important.
Okay, that brings us smack into the role of the only person who has to listen to this swamp of words. The poor, uninterested Hungarian bartender back in the Sparschwein.
Yeah, the grounding force. He's constantly performing what the sources call desublimation, pulling the narrator back down to earth.
The bartender's role is just brilliant. He's the ultimate pragmatic foil, isn't he? His interruptions, they're just designed to puncture the narrator's attempts at being profound or overly dramatic.
Exactly. That famous moment where the narrator is lost in some deep philosophical spiral about his miserable existence. And the bartender, who's probably wiped down the bar for the 10th time, just cuts in flatly with, "Please get to the point."
It's just perfect. Necessary, dry comedy.
These are the cooling down moments. They remind us, the readers, that this guy isn't some wise sage. He's a drunk, failed academic in a pretty miserable bar, and his audience is, frankly, bored stiff.
But the bartender's skepticism, it's not just impatience, is it? He actually challenges the whole story.
He does. Like when the narrator, after maybe 40 pages of this agonizing detail, tries to assure him everything was true. And the bartender just throws him completely off kilter by asking what is true.
Which is just devastatingly simple.
Exactly. And whether he's genuinely asking a philosophical question or just completely lost, the effect is the same. It fundamentally undermines the authority, the reliability of the narrator's entire account. The bartender, in a way, he's like the common reader, just wanting clarity, wanting certainty, wanting the plot.
And this clash between the guy talking endlessly and the guy just wanting the bottom line, it really peaks when the narrator comes back to the bar to tell the story of the final crucial meeting with the warden, Jose Miguel. The bartender wants the resolution. The so what happened.
Right, the payoff. But the narrator delivers the ultimate anticlimax. He claims he refused to hear the final definitive piece of information about the wolf's death.
You stopped him.
He says something like, "As I expected, so I asked him not to tell me. We just embraced. And I left him." The narrator makes this conscious choice to stop short of the answer, completely frustrating the listeners and the bartender's expectation of closure.
The bartender must have been livid. And that refusal to know, that ties right into the whole framework of the novel, creating what our sources call the frozen time loop.
Yeah, the book constantly jumps back and forth, doesn't it? Between the drunken telling in the bar, and the extremadura past the actual journey.
So the story is always filtered through alcohol, trauma, anxiety.
We never get direct access. We're always one step removed, hearing it secondhand.
And this jumping back and forth, this dual timeline, it creates that stickiness of time you mentioned earlier. He's stuck in this loop of retelling, revising, never really moving forward.
And the ultimate structural failure is that deliberate refusal at the end. By stopping Jose Miguel from giving the final answer, the narrator effectively freezes both timelines. The past story, what actually happened to the wolf, remains unfinished. And the present telling, the narrator's monologue in the bar, also remains unfinished.
They're just suspended, forever looping. Incomplete action, incomplete thought, marked only by that single final period at the very end of the book.
The period ends the massive sentence, sure, but it doesn't end the obsession. It doesn't resolve the trauma. The narrator just keeps replaying that ending in his head, day after day, stuck in the Sparschwein, never putting the final word down on paper.
It's the ultimate anti-closure. The structure fails to resolve because the narrator chooses failure. The failure is the point.
Exactly.
Okay, that refusal, that brings us neatly into section 3. The 3 failures: system, speech, and witnessing. The story seems to work on these 3 interconnected levels of breakdown. Let's start with the most bureaucratic one, the failure of the Systemic Commission.
Right. The whole plot kicks off because of an administrative failure, essentially. Right. The funding foundation, the institution that sent the letter, they likely wanted something simple, positive, grant-friendly, a report on the flowering wildlands.
Manageable PR, something they could use.
Precisely. That was the system's expectation. Find a nice story, package it, monetize it.
But our narrator, in his kind of self-destructive academic way, he goes and digs up the unreportable truth. The local extinction, the smuggling, the violence, the messy, tragic certainty of loss. You can't put that in a brochure.
No. And this is a major supply and demand misalignment, as the sources put it. It leads directly to his complete creative paralysis. The truth he finds is just too complex, too tragic, too incompatible with what the institution wanted.
So the system can't contain or make use of the truth he uncovered.
And he can't deliver what the system mandated. He finds the truth, but he fails the commission. He goes back to Berlin, never writes the article, and just gets trapped in that internal failed monologue we hear in the bar.
It's a pretty powerful critique of how systems, maybe especially the knowledge economy, handle difficult truths. The system couldn't use the tragic reality, and the narrator couldn't produce a usable product. The truth was just too messy for the bureaucracy.
Right. So from that institutional failure, we move inwards to the failure of language and reliability, which is really the core of that whole single-sentence issue we discussed. The narrator is just explicitly unreliable. He's constantly shifting his ground, emotionally, factually.
He tries to present himself in a certain way, maybe claim some moral high ground, but then we see him contradict himself constantly.
Yeah, there's that moment, a really key moment of potential shared grief, when the translator breaks down in tears. And he admits just for a second to feeling furious at her display of emotion.
But then he immediately backtracks.
Instantly denies it. Says his character would never allow such an angry thought. It creates this deep sense of distrust.
You just can't rely on him.
Not really.
Yeah.
Between his wordy, complex denials and the bartender just bluntly interrupting him, his words never gain full authority. That self-doubt, the negation correction thing built into the sentence structure, it ultimately cripples our ability as readers to trust his interpretation. And this failure of language is exactly why he gives up on the written word entirely. He's a failed academic, partly because his own language is just insufficient to convey a clear, solid truth.
Okay, the deepest level of failure, the ethical one. Let's get into that. The ethical failure of witnessing. Is his final refusal stopping Jose Miguel, is that an ethical act? Or is it just, intellectual cowardice, giving up?
That's the really profound question the novel leaves us with, I think. It taps into that fundamental paradox of testimony, especially when you're trying to speak for the dead or for the non-human world like the wolf.
There's always a risk.
A huge risk of appropriation, of taking that profound tragedy and turning it into human narrative capital. Capitalizing on loss for your own story.
And the narrator seems aware of his own shortcomings here. He feels shame because he can't match the translator's raw grief. He realizes his failure isn't just about getting the facts right. It's about this deep, emotional, ethical disconnect.
He admits it directly. He says, "My heart did not break," like hers did.
Okay.
And because he recognizes this disconnect, he feels he lacks the moral authority to write the story, to produce some kind of official memorial text, a neat literary summing up.
So interrupting Jose Miguel, refusing that final confession, it's intentional, an act of anti-closure.
That's how our sources frame it. Yes, it's a deliberate choice. He's not just giving up, he's actively choosing restraint. He steps back from the burden of carrying the full weight of that trauma, and importantly, he refuses to provide a neat, final narrative that would inevitably sort of domesticate the horror of extinction, make it manageable.
So does that refusal actually count as a positive ethical stance?
Within the novel's logic, yes, it seems to. It's presented as this act of self-limiting ethics. He acknowledges human boundaries, he retreats, and in doing so, he reserves what the sources call the dignity of silence for the lost other, for the wolf.
So he avoids the bigger sin, maybe, of overreach, of speaking for the dead.
Exactly. That seems to be the greater ethical failing he avoids, more significant than just failing to deliver an article.
Which means, in this light, failure isn't just a sad outcome, it's transformed into the novel's deliberate method.
Precisely. Failure provides the anti-closure, and that anti-closure keeps the trauma institutional, linguistic, ethical. He keeps it open, unresolved, available for ongoing thought. It ensures the wolf's story can't just be neatly packaged, simplified, and forgotten by human storytelling. It forces us, the readers, to confront the fact that maybe true objective witness is impossible when faced with such profound, irreversible loss.
Okay, let's move into section 4 then. The ecological elegy and decentering the human. This novel is fundamentally a song of warning, isn't it? And that's rooted right there in the title word, last. Last.
Yeah, it immediately signals irreversible finality. The novel is structured, themed, as an elegy, a formal expression of grief for something that's already gone. And the initial setup, as we said, is based on that scientific quote about the last wolf dying in 1983.
But then the actual truth, or the version Jose Miguel eventually offers, is different. It was likely 1993, 10 years later.
Right. And that discrepancy is crucial because it doesn't bring any relief. It's not like, oh, good, we had 10 more years.
No.
Our sources emphasize that this reveal only confirms the death was drawn out, protracted, making the whole process of extinction feel even more agonizing. It deepens the emotional weight of the unavoidable end.
And the most haunting character in the book, the one it's named after, the wolf itself, is paradoxically completely absent. It's the absent presence, the ghost wolf.
Yeah, the title character, the focus of the obsession, is utterly gone from the landscape the narrator traverses. He never sees a live wolf.
He just finds relics, fragments.
Exactly. He sees that awful stuffed specimen in the glass case at the hunter's house. And he just hears these contradictory secondhand stories. The whole narrative is a telling about telling, constantly keeping the reader at a distance from the core event itself, the extinction.
And that deliberate distance makes the wolf feel spectral, ghostly.
It becomes this haunting absence, existing only in memory, and a very contested memory at that.
So the ghost wolf embodies this critical ecological idea.
I think so. That deceased nature, you can't truly bring it back or contain it neatly in human stories. You can only evoke it as this lingering, maybe disturbing presence. The wolf gets elevated beyond just biology into this profound spiritual symbol defined by its very absence.
And the landscape itself, Extremadura, adds to that spiritual weight. It's depicted as so barren, desolate, scarce vegetation, dry heat, broken ground. It really feels like an end-time setting.
The scenery creates this palpable feeling of physical decay, doesn't it? It's like a stage set for a world winding down, which mirrors the protagonist's internal state perfectly.
And the local characters add another layer, infusing the wolf's fate with almost supernatural elements.
Right. Jose Miguel talks about traps being mysteriously loosened, suggesting some other force, maybe the land itself, was trying to help the last survivors.
These local legends, they turn the extinction into something more than just ecological loss. It becomes a regional myth. It shifts the wolf definitively from biology to something spiritual, making the tragedy feel even deeper than just numbers.
And we have to remember that line the narrator picks up on, that profound local feeling. Love for animals is the only love that never disappoints. It highlights this belief in a kind of moral purity in the non-human world, which stands in sharp contrast to all the human failure and cynicism back in the Berlin bar.
Okay, so all of this, the desolate place, the spiritual undertones, it sets the stage for the narrator's final ethical decision, the self-limiting ethics, the retreat. Why is failure, this retreat, presented as the only ethical path for the human here? letting the non-human tragedy stand alone.
Because the narrator is so acutely aware of his own emotional limits that my heart did not break moment, he chooses to withdraw. That's the core ethical choice. By refusing to hear the final word or write the definitive story, he actively avoids objectifying the tragedy.
Turning it into a product.
Yeah, into a literary product for his own potential gain or career. He recognizes that providing that neat, authored closure would essentially complete the human takeover of the wolf's memory.
So he practices restraint instead, acknowledges his own limits.
Yes, reserving that dignity of silence for the lost other. He actively rejects the very human urge towards narrative overreach, the hubris of thinking we can fully capture, explain, and ultimately control the story of the dead, domesticate their horror, turn loss into just another story. His failure to complete the commission becomes his ethical success.
And aesthetically, what does this retreat achieve? Our sources mention the negative sublime. That sounds important, but needs unpacking.
Right. So the traditional sublime, think romantic paintings, mountains, storms.
Yeah.
It's that feeling of awe we get when we confront something overwhelming in nature. But ultimately, we find a sense of human mastery or triumph in our ability to perceive and understand that power.
Okay. The negative sublime is the opposite.
Kinda, yeah. Krasznahorkai achieves awe through powerlessness.
Ah, okay.
It's a sense of awe that comes not from human mastery over nature, but from acknowledging human inadequacy, our smallness, our inability to control or fully comprehend. The narrator's silent admission of failure, that feeling of limitation, allows him, paradoxically, to experience this higher form of reverence, maybe melancholy. It's that humbling sense of limitation that elevates the novel.
And the novel uses its two main settings to really drive home this limitation, contrasting them to show the boundaries of human consciousness.
Absolutely. You have Berlin, the setting for language overload. It's the place of chaotic, redundant, looping language, that endless sentence where true meaning feels impossible to pin down. It symbolizes human consciousness trapped in its own, often self-defeating structures.
And then you have the wild Extremadura, which is the setting for information scarcity.
Right there, the narrator's senses are basically useless. He can't find the wolf directly. He's completely reliant on these fragmented, conflicting, flawed, secondhand stories from others.
So the contrast teaches him something.
And us, the readers, yeah, that humanity isn't the measure of everything. In the place of too much language, Berlin, he finds no clear meaning. In the place of nature, Extremadura, he finds his own perception is unreliable. He's forced to step back from the center, to acknowledge the failure of human systems, linguistic, perceptual, to really grasp or control irreversible loss.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. What does this all mean for us? Bringing this deep dive into Krasznahorkai's really complex experiment to a close.
Well, I think we followed a pretty clear thread. The specific mood of the era, that endgame grammar, it fueled a novel that uses failure as its method. And that method ultimately achieves this profound decentering of the human. The novel seems to argue that when faced with something like ecological finality, our traditional human stories, the quest, the clear answer, the neat ending they have to structurally break down, they aren't adequate anymore.
So what is Krasznahorkai suggesting about literature's role now in this time of irreversible ecological loss, especially given those political failures like COP15 we talked about?
I think he's showing that literature's job isn't necessarily to provide easy answers or to mobilize people politically or offer simple rallying cries. Maybe its role is to use radical formal experiment like the long sentence, like the anti-closer, to force us into a prolonged, difficult, humbling encounter with the unspoken truth. The failure of the language becomes, paradoxically, a kind of success for an ethics of restraint.
He uses failure to make us fail better.
That's a great way to put it. Absolutely. By making us acknowledge our fundamental inability to fully capture or solve these huge crises, the failure lets us practice a kind of minimal ethics, a humbling recognition of our limited place among all finite beings, maybe demanding silent contemplation from us rather than more aggressive storytelling.
Which leaves us with a really powerful final thought to chew on. If the novel's structure is all about refusing to provide a neat ending for the wolf story, doesn't that refusal kind of hand the responsibility over to us, the readers, to hold on to the story's unclosed trauma?
That final period, it ends the narrator's telling, yes. But the failure itself ensures the wolf story doesn't just end there. It continues, unresolved, inside the narrator's head. And now, maybe inside ours too.
So the real work, that silent contemplation you mentioned, it starts exactly where the book stops.